Erik, Chapter 9. A short while after that first evening at the opera, I hit another snag. I required a piano for my music writing. I needed a way to ensure that the note I wrote down on the page matched the note that rang in my ears. For a time, I would gather up all my writing equipment and trudge upstairs to one of the pianos backstage. But I often found, after putting in all that work of packing things and ensuring I had not forgotten anything downstairs, my urge to write down music would disappear. I still used the time in the dead of night to work on improving my skills as a keyboard player. I was finally able to work out how to make both my hands play together to create the thick, lush melodies I had admired as a child. It took a special kind of mental focus I had never had to use before. I began to plan how I could get a full piano down to my chambers across the lake. I designed a type of barge that would support my piano and roped it to my little boat. It was essentially just a raft of lumber nailed together, wide enough to stand the little piano on. But I would need a confederate to ensure that the piano was steady all the way across the lake. I settled on a stagehand named Joseph Bouquet. He seemed like the quiet type, a man who would not be inclined to spill my secrets. I planned to drug him, then have him wake blindfolded. Then he'd help me by lending a steadying hand to my cargo as we crossed the lake. Afterward, I planned to free him completely by drugging him again and hauling him back to his room. When he woke in his bed, I hoped he'd consider the whole experience to be a bad dream. The piano moving was a success. We got it off the barge and settled into the middle of my main chamber, and I got Bouquet returned to his own chamber without an incident. As an added touch, I surrounded his bed with alcohol bottles so he would think he had been on a drunken bender. To my dismay, though, the man didn't believe his time with me to be a dream, and went around talking about me to everyone he met. I grew more irritated every time I heard people repeating a rumor that could only have come from Bouquet. I hoped he'd settle down and back off before I had to do something about the problem. In the meantime, I spent nearly every waking hour at my piano. It provided the focus for my main chamber, and I reverently set Miriam's music box atop it. The little monkey watched me as I worked, gazing at me in a friendly manner. After a couple of months of daily practice, I started to find piano playing boring. It consisted of merely following a code, pressing a certain key to correspond to a marking on a page. I kept the piano nearby, as I was still using it to write music down. But I ceased to practice works written by anyone else. A new idea struck me. I remembered the organ at the little church, and how the organist had used both hands and both feet to play notes on 3 different keyboards. I decided that this was a worthy challenge to master. Getting the organ to my chambers required some planning, as it had with the piano, but I realized that I could transport the organ in pieces and assemble it in my chamber. Piece by piece, pipe by pipe, I brought it all down to my chamber and installed it against the back wall of my main space. The piano lost its spot at center stage and was moved to the side of the room. I left the music box on the piano, though. My obsession with music was making me think less often of Miriam. I was grateful for the reprieve from the knife of pain that struck me when she crossed my mind, even so many years and half a continent away from the circumstances that had taken her from me. Several more months of tireless practice made me proficient on the organ. It was the same as the piano, after all, just with more keys to press. As an experiment, I weighed down one of its keys with a rock and got into my boat, traveling back to the opera side of the lake. The sound of the organ faded at about the middle of the lake, so I knew I could play to my heart's content without being heard by anyone who approached the lake. I wondered what other instruments I could set myself to master. I remembered that kind man at the fair. What was his name again? Saying that I would very likely be a good violinist. I purchased an instrument and set the bow to the strings for the first time in my life. I was a disaster. My entire body tensed as I tried to hold it under my chin without dropping it. My arms and wrists likewise locked as I tried to both hold it securely and lift and lower my fingers to change the notes. And the sound as I drew the bow across the strings. I still shudder if I happen to remember it. It sounded like a host of demon cats had been dropped in the lake and were voicing their disapproval. I realized a new approach would be required. I was still attending performances in the auditorium above, moving into and out of my box 5 unseen thanks to its secret door. Once or twice I found other patrons in my box, and I sent an angry letter to Lefebvre about it. I watched him from a view hole that had been cut into his office wall as he read my mail. He scoffed aloud and ripped up the letter. I reminded him that I was not to be trifled with by changing the lock on his office door, essentially locking him out of his office. Then I showed my cloaked form backstage to the entire opera company, sending many of them chasing after Lefebvre to report what they had seen. The man was completely overwhelmed by his frantic employees and had no space to retreat to, no desk to hide behind. From then on, I had no problems with having my box completely to myself. From my box, I watched the orchestra as they played the music to support the singers. The violinists especially attracted my attention. How did they play so melodiously on that instrument I was coming to fear? I decided that I would ask one of them to help me learn. I had long been turning over a scheme in my mind for parting the artists at the opera with some of their hard-earned coin. I did the same to them as I did to the management. I delivered each orchestra member and singer a note demanding 5 francs per month in exchange for safety from the opera ghost. 5 francs was even less a percentage of their income than the 2% I had demanded from the management, but multiplied by 75 full and part-time musicians and 35 full and part-time singers, it made a steady income stream for me. I got to pull a few more acts of sabotage and intimidation on those who held out on me, but eventually they all caved in and began to pay. By the way, I am aware of how this extortion makes me look. I can only plead my excuse that I had been deprived of parents and family, mistreated by the world, habituated to violent death, lost the love of my life, and I was still only 21 years old. In my youth, I felt myself perfectly justified in taking from those around me to lift myself to prosperity. For the violinists, I altered my demands somewhat. I informed them they could either pay my bribe or give me weekly violin lessons. Old Claudin accepted my offer. I arranged to meet him in a certain closet backstage, a closet that had a hidden passageway behind its back wall. I stood there and played, and Claudin stood on his side of the wall and listened to my scratchings. Then he would make suggestions, and I would try it again. The man must have been a true master of his art, for he heard the poor positions of my head, my spine, my elbows, and my wrists in the sounds that I made, and he knew what to say to get me to fix them. He suggested songs that I might try in order to practice my playing and improve it. He also taught me how to properly maintain the instrument and its bow so that they would properly respond to my movements. I relaxed and gained in confidence as I heard my sound improve, developing a rich, mellow tone that sounded like melted butter. I thanked Claudin after our last lesson and excused him from the payments for the rest of his opera career. I offered to convince Lefebvre that he, Claudin, should be next in line for the concertmaster post after Rémi's upcoming retirement, but he declined my offer. I did the same with the singers. I knew that I had a good voice, but I wanted to know how the singers had the power to fill the entire auditorium above. and I wanted to try singing things that would let me play with my voice and fill it with emotion. The dry, holy music of the church had been adequate for me as a child, but I wanted more now. I thought that if I could put emotions into my voice, I could pretend to myself that I was feeling them, that I was the character who sang the song in the opera. I wanted to live the lives of those characters for a while, instead of my own. Again, it was a senior member of the chorus who accepted my offer. I listened to Jacques tell me how he used all the muscles of his body to project his voice to the very cheapest seat in the back of the auditorium. I tried to emulate him, and the depth of sound that I began to produce astounded me. As I studied and began to master all this music, I was constantly struck by the beauty of the sounds I could produce. That sounds like shameless self-flattery, but it was mostly the way the music was structured and put together that created the beauty. It captured my attention, precisely because it was at odds with the blood-soaked life I had lived in Persia. How could one world encompass both the beautiful elegance of a Strauss waltz and the sense of helpless, cowardly fear I had felt as I moved that fateful lever? I could feel the music tugging at me, calling me to abandon the gruesome thought patterns that had sustained me in my previous life. I began to dream of waltzing around a flower-strewn ballroom with a faceless lady, instead of the nightmares of blood and death I was used to. But circumstances reminded me that I could not completely abandon the instincts that protected me from harm. Bouquet continued to spread rumors about me, and things came to a head one night when he led a mob of people down to find and capture me. He spoke loudly about bringing me to justice, even though I hadn't committed any major crimes in Paris. The mob came as far as the shore of the lake, although they didn't find the engineer's boat, and were largely unwilling to swim through the inky blackness. One or two enterprising souls jumped in, but soon climbed out again as they realized they were in the minority. I devised a system that would ring a bell in my home whenever movement was detected on the opposite shore of the lake. It served as my early warning that trouble was on its way. I also sectioned off some space inside my chambers and reproduced the mirrored maze that I had built for the Shah. It was a system that best fit the available space, and I had long thought that the idea that a prisoner killed themselves, freeing the Shah from guilt, was quite clever. I built it so that I would have a way to convince anyone who invaded my home that it was more than their life was worth to return after I ejected them. Finally, I set about building myself an alternate escape route, in case trouble should come directly to my shore. This caused me no end of effort, as I had to carve a staircase into the compressed earth in the back of my chambers, and make it link up with the deserted hallway that runs on the floor above. There are a few twists in that staircase even yet as I corrected my course to make it match up. I reasoned that the unpredictability of the staircase could only work in my favor if someone was pursuing me up it. In my free time, I continued my habit of leaving my chambers and strolling through the upper stories. My favorite time of day to do this was early evening, before the show had started. Everyone was busy preparing for their evening, and no one worried about whether a ghost watched them at work. I discovered a passageway that led behind the dressing rooms. It was lined with doors made of tinted glass, and I went through one, after checking there was no one on the other side of it. I found that I had entered the dressing room through the large mirror affixed to the wall that was actually a door. From the dressing room, the glass appeared to be a mirror, though it could be seen through from the passageway. I stored this information away and continued on. From time to time I would discover one of the artists, usually a man, attempting to extort another artist, usually a woman, asking them to pay either money or favor in return for advancement within the opera company. Most ironically of all, this was advancement that they were unable to guarantee, as they didn't have the authority to grant it. One of the repeat offenders was a tenor named Giraud. Two of the women later disappeared from the opera company. One of the women was a mezzo-soprano whose performances I had come to enjoy greatly, and I was irked that I would no longer be able to watch her on the stage. I decided that Giraud merited a visit from the opera ghost. I caught the man on one of the rare evenings he was alone. He sat in his dressing room after the performance and worked on taking his costume and makeup off. I locked the main door into the room, then circled around through the secret passageway. I stood behind the mirror and watched him, then reached for the valve I had installed on the gas line that fed the fixtures in his room. I adjusted the level of the flame a couple of times, sending shadows dancing around him, then plunged the little room into darkness with a half twist of the valve. Only the little oil lamp on his dressing table still lit the space. I opened the mirror door and stepped inside. He was standing at the switch that would have controlled the gas fixture if I had not blocked the supply line. His manipulation of the switch did nothing. I took advantage of his distraction and placed my hand on his shoulder. He whirled at my touch and took a good look at me in my white mask and evening dress. I felt a little touch of fear, myself, as I had not realized how the man would tower over me when I was up close to him. But my reputation preceded me, the reputation that was heavy with misdeeds attributed to me that should not have been. He sank into a chair and stared up at me wordlessly. I bent down and placed my hands on the arms of the chair. I have come to tell you that I require you to change your ways. Your predatory behavior has halted the careers of too many women whose performances I used to enjoy. You need to find your victims elsewhere, outside the opera. This is your only warning, monsieur. He sneered at me and stood, pushing me away from him. I sensed that this was not the first time he had had a confrontation like this. I refused to justify myself. I pulled the little vial that I had prepared out from under my cloak. He was across the room with his hand on the doorknob, ready to leave, but my next sentence stopped him. You will stop this destructive path, monsieur, or I will make women want to get as far away from you as they can. Have you ever seen a vial of this before? I held it up tauntingly and swirled the oily contents. His eyes flicked to the vial, and a horrified suspicion began to dawn in his eyes. Is that... He couldn't even finish the question. I took a step toward him, and he flinched. Is it what, monsieur? Oh, is it sulfuric acid? Why, yes, it is. The finest available in Paris. You've heard what sulfuric acid will do, of course. The skin will blister and burn, and the unfortunate victim endures terrible agony as it works. By the time it has finished, the victim ends up looking much like this. And I ripped off the mask and hairpiece I wore. He cringed back against the wall as he took in my deformity. I saw his eyes widen as he realized what his life might be like if he looked like me. He snapped suddenly and sank back into his chair. Please, monsieur, put it away. I will stop threatening the ladies, I swear. Only don't throw that on me. Believe me, monsieur, I will do as you ask. He covered his face with his hands and bowed his head, cringing away from me and my vial. Very well, I'll be watching, I stated. I swept back out the mirror door and closed it silently, watching through it until he cautiously raised his head from his hands and looked around the room. I twisted the gas valve back to its open position, and the room filled with light again. Giraud left the opera company soon afterward, a move I found entirely fitting. The opera company, decimated by vacancies, decided that it was time to hold an open audition call for musicians and singers.